Welcome. This is an audio lecture on the art of quoting, or the making of what will become known later on in the video as an intellectual sandwich. This is probably one of the most important lecture videos that you will watch in this class. There's only a couple. The reason for that is this is entirely about how to take the research you do and integrate it into the papers that you are writing. This is a research writing class, and so utilizing that research correctly and well is going to be of utmost importance. So this is our crash course in doing that. You'll get to try to practice this on the quiz that is associated with this lecture, and then also in all of your essays, I will be looking at the way that you're doing these things. So let's begin. One important question we have to answer first is, why is it valuable to quote other materials? Why use secondary sources at all? Well, what you're doing when you're writing a research paper is you are entering an intellectual conversation surrounding your topic. When you write, when you do research and when you write, you are not working in a vacuum. You're not the only person to ever write about any of the things that we're going to be talking about in this course. And so what you're doing is you are acknowledging that you are part of a larger conversation. You're bringing yourself into that conversation. Rather than giving a soliloquy, you are discussing by engaging in other voices. And this adds extra depth to your arguments and increases their credibility. However, what I often see students doing is they simply plop a quote in wherever they feel like it in an essay. Oh, I need to quote 3 sources. I'm going to just put one on the first page, one on the second page, one on the third page, and I'm good to go. That's not what you want to do. It's not enough to simply insert quotations wherever you feel like. Instead, quotes need to be framed in some capacity. Readers need to first know that quotes are coming, and then they need to understand how they work with the ideas that you are trying to present. They need to be able to see the reason that you've chosen to include the quote you have. This is where we come to what I call the quoting sandwich. A well-executed quote involves 3 parts, much like a sandwich. First, you have an introduction, and that is the top slice of bread. Then you have the quote itself, which is your lunch meat, your lettuce, whatever other things you put on your sandwich. And then the bottom slice of bread is some kind of explanation or analysis to your quote. So we're going to go through all 3 of these. So quoting actually takes a good amount of work, and it also ends up taking a good amount of space. The reason, partially, that research essays can require you to have more pages than you might have been used to writing is because a well-done quote, a well-used quote, takes up a good amount of space in a paper. You'll see a couple of examples of this a little bit later. So let's talk about each of these 3 parts in turn. First, we have the introduction. This is where you identify the writer and where available his or her credentials. That is what makes this writer somebody you should listen to, or what they have to say matter, or relevant, or authoritative. So here's an example. Matt Stone says. That is at the very basic an introduction, if nothing else. However, I want more. I want to know more than just Matt Stone says. I want to know who he is, why we should listen to him. So if I said, Matt Stone, one of the creators of South Park, says, now I know why his statement is relevant, assuming that there is some reason that saying that he's a creator of South Park is relevant. So you find things out about the writer that offers some sense of why what they have to say is relevant to what they're actually saying. However, you can go even further here. When I have Matt Stone, one of the creators of South Park, says, I know why what he is saying is relevant, but is he just stating a fact? Instead of saying says or writes, those again are very basic and will get the job done generally speaking. But you want to use instead what I call, or what are called, signal phrases. That would be a word or phrase like argues, believes, claims, interprets, a verb that is tied directly to the kind of quote we're getting. So if they are stating a fact, You might say Matt Stone, one of the creators of South Park, states, if it's a fact. But if he's arguing something, if he's giving us his opinion, you might say Matt Stone, one of the creators of South Park, argues. Then I, as a reader, know why his statement is relevant. So that's the introduction. Then we have the quote itself. We've already talked a little bit about how citations look when you read the video on MLA formatting, but let's go over some of this. Everything that you want from your source goes inside quotation marks. Beginning of quote to the end of the quote. Immediately following the quote, you insert the citation. Parentheses, last name, page number, close parentheses. And then you end with the period after the citation. We've already done this, so I don't need to cover a whole lot of this. Just a couple of things I will note here. You'll see those 3 periods in between the words beginning of quote and end of quote. This is what we call an ellipsis. Ellipses are only used when you are leaving something out. So if you're leaving something out of a quote, you will include that. So then we get to the explanation. Once you've completed your quote, it's important that you clarify what the writer's meaning is and interpret the points that he or she has made. So I might say after my quote, Stone's point is that we shouldn't take everything we see in South Park. This becomes obvious when we give further consideration to blah, blah, blah. In this example, I have explained or clarified what it is that Stone means in his quote. My explanation should also link the writer's idea to my own. Remember, the reason that you're using these is to link your writing to the larger conversation, to enter the dialogue that's already taking place. So you might say, Stone is correct in his assertion. Similarly, I would argue that, blah, blah, blah. You want to bring what the quotes have to say back to your own ideas. It could be something as simple as, I agree with Matt Stone, or I disagree with this interpretation of the text, or I think that this interpretation or analysis forgets or leaves out blah, blah, blah. All sorts of things. So let's take a quick look at a couple of quick examples. Here's example number 1. Susan Bordeaux writes about women in dieting. Fiji is just one example. Until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs from the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of girls surveyed reported dieting. I think Bordeaux is right. Another point Bordeaux makes is that blah, blah, blah. Now, let's take a look at this closely from each of our 3 elements of a quote and figure out what's wrong here. Because this one's got problems. This is bad. This would not get a good score if I saw it in a paper. Item number 1 is, yes, we get the name of the person who wrote this, Susan Bordeaux. But I have no idea who she is or why what she has to say is important. So we do have some kind of introduction, but we don't really get it in smoothly. We'll look at a much smoother example here in a moment. But the problem with the quote is we don't have a citation. It's in quotation marks, but there should be a citation. Also, this is a generally good rule of thumb. Never have the last thing in a paragraph be a quotation mark or a citation. Always, always, always have your interpretation following it. Additionally, so we have that problem. So we do have some kind of interpretation in the I think Bordeaux is right. However, take a look at what is actually been quoted. What's been quoted is not an opinion. What's been quoted is a fact, right? These are details of observation, observable empirical information. And so this writer shouldn't have just said, I think Bordeaux is right, because Bordeaux, they're not quoting an assertion from Susan Bordeaux of any sort. So you have to make sure that what you're saying about the quotes actually aligns with what's been quoted. Let's take a look at a second example that is much better. First thing you will notice when you look at this example is that this paragraph is significantly longer. The reality is when you use source material well, it takes up space. So the nice thing is that when you need to write a 5-page paper, you'll get a lot of that out of simply doing things correctly. But they're going to look longer. So don't rush through quoting material. If you rush through it, I'm literally talking about the process of you putting the quotes in. You've probably done something wrong and haven't given them the amount of time they need. But let's read this example. The feminist philosopher Susan Bordo deplores Western media's obsession with female thinness and dieting. Her basic complaint is that increasing numbers of women across the globe are being led to see themselves as fat and in need of a diet. Citing the islands of Fiji as a case in point, Bordo notes that, until television was introduced in 1995, the islands had no reported cases of eating disorders. In 1998, 3 years after programs from the United States and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of the girls surveyed reported dieting. 149, 150. Bordo's point is that the Western cult of dieting is spreading even to remote places across the globe. Ultimately, Bordo complains, the culture of dieting will find you, regardless of where you live. Bordo's observations ring true to me because most women I know, regardless of where they are from, are seriously unhappy with their weight, etc., etc. So first of all, introduction-wise, this is much better. Now I know that Susan Bordo is a feminist philosopher and that she deplores Western media's obsession with female thinness and dieting. We get a little summary of what kinds of things she's talking about, and then look how much more smoothly this is introduced. Citing the islands of Fiji as a case in point, Bordo notes that, etc., etc. So that's much more smoothly integrated. It reads with much greater ease. And then at the end of the quote itself, we've got a nice citation, perfectly done. End quotation mark, parentheses, page numbers, close parentheses, period. Now remember that, as we talked about in the MLA video, if you are identifying the writer beforehand, as is done here, you don't have to put Bordo's name. If this person had wanted to put Bordo 149 to 150, that would also be correct. Then we get part 3, the interpretation. Bordo's point is that the Western cult of dieting is spreading even to remote places across the globe. So we see that this is explaining what it is that this person believes Bordo is saying. Then we've got, ultimately, Bordo complains. Another one of those signal phrases. Note this one comes after the quote, but this is still a smart thing to do, because she's levying a complaint about the cult of dieting, the culture of dieting. And then, in the next paragraph, this person gives us a link to their own idea and is going to continue that train of thought. This is an excellently done example of how this should happen. Now, the question that some people ask is, should I always quote? Do I have the option of, and the answer is no. You can also paraphrase or summarize material instead. So what's the difference? Paraphrasing or summarizing both involve not using the exact words of the source that you're referring to. You're still retaining the ideas of the source, though, so you still need to utilize some kind of citation. The differences here are that a paraphrase is usually about the same length of the passage that you're choosing not to quote. It utilizes very similar language, and it's a reference to a very particular part, paragraph, piece of information, etc., from the source. So, and I've posted links on our class site to some examples that you'll be able to take a look at. So, a paraphrase might be, you want to cite 3 sentences from somebody's source, but you want to write them in your own words. You'd write approximately 3 sentences, but you'd still give a citation. A summary is much shorter than the original work being referred to. Usually what you're doing is you're trying to capture a larger idea, but in much, much fewer words. So if you're trying to give the entire idea of what someone said. So a summary of this PowerPoint would be, Dr. Bauman explains the importance of introducing, correctly citing, and explaining quotes. Whereas a paraphrase would be you taking one slide and explaining the content in your own words. That's the difference. So a sentence is maybe a summary is maybe 1 sentence per paragraph being summarized, but that's not an exact ratio. You don't need to say, okay, I'm summarizing this 10-paragraph article, so I need 10 sentences. That's not true. It's just a way for you to see that it's much, much shorter and pared down. Okay, so those are the basics of quoting and paraphrasing and summarizing. There are some other elements to quoting that aren't included here. You probably have questions about block quotes and those sorts of things. We will talk about those in class. For the purposes of your basics quiz, the only stuff you need to know and be able to handle is that which is in here. Please take a look at the links on Canvas to some examples of summaries and paraphrases. You will need to take a look at those in advance of the quiz, and then remember that there is the quiz due. Okay, there we go. That's it.